Watch out, you're going to hit one of our deputies. Stop, stop.
Those frantic words echo through the darkness of an early September morning in Frederick County, Maryland. It's just after 1:30 a.m., and what began as a routine night shift has suddenly turned volatile. Moments earlier, the Frederick County Sheriff's Office received a disturbing 911 call from outside a Costco depot in New Market. The caller wasn't reporting a robbery. There was no crash, no fire, no obvious crime in progress. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line sounded shaken, uncertain, almost confused. There was a truck driver, he said, a man who appeared to be begging for help. But something was wrong. According to the caller, the driver was incoherent, his speech disjointed, his behavior erratic. The truck had been parked on the wrong side of the road, and without warning, it suddenly began rolling backward at alarming speed. The caller jumped out of his own vehicle, shouting, asking if the man was okay. The driver stopped in the middle of the road, blocking traffic with massive trailers attached. His words were repetitive, desperate. I need help. I need help. At first, it looked like a medical emergency. Maybe a heart attack. Maybe a diabetic episode. The caller even told dispatch he wasn't sure if the man was having some kind of episode. But as seconds passed, unease turned into fear. The driver climbed out of his cab, not to seek help, but to unhook the trailer from inside the truck and leave it abandoned in the roadway. Security cameras later confirmed what the caller described. The truck sat half-blocking the road. The trailer detached. The driver moving without logic or explanation. Then came another detail, one that raised the hair on the dispatcher's neck. The truck's windows were shattered, broken from the inside, glass scattered outward, not inward. A sign of rage, panic, or something far more disturbing. The caller left to alert Costco staff, urging them to call for help. When he returned, the situation had escalated. The driver was now laying on the horn, screaming at the truck, smashing the interior, acting as though the vehicle itself was his enemy. By the time deputies arrived, Costco security guards were waiting for them. They warned the officers immediately. The man was unstable, yelling, destroying property, refusing to calm down. The deputies approached carefully. Put your hands on the steering wheel. The driver complied, but barely. The corporal introduced himself calmly, his voice steady, practiced. He reassured the man they weren't there to arrest him, that they just wanted to make sure he was okay, that this didn't have to go badly. But the man's responses made little sense. He stared ahead, breathing erratically, his eyes unfocused. He didn't answer simple questions directly. When asked if someone else was in the truck, he hesitated. When asked if he had weapons, he said no, but refused to show his other hand at first. Deputies exchanged glances. Behind the scenes, they began preparing for the worst. Stop sticks were quietly placed near the tires, both front and rear, while the corporal continued trying to talk the man down. He asked about medical conditions, diabetes, sugar issues, whether the man wanted an ambulance. The driver spat onto the pavement. He wouldn't turn off the engine, and that refusal would soon make terrifying sense. As the conversation dragged on, the man suddenly shifted the truck into gear. Stop sticks popped beneath the wheels, but the vehicle kept moving. Tires shredded, rubber flapping, metal scraping pavement. The truck lurched forward, then backward, then sideways, careening through the Costco lot while deputies scrambled to keep civilians out of harm's way. Look, there are innocent people around here, one officer pleaded. But the driver didn't slow. Some deputies speculated drugs, PCP, meth, something powerful enough to detach a person from reality. Others realized this was no longer a standoff. It was a pursuit, and it was only getting more dangerous. What none of them knew, what no one could possibly imagine, was that the reason this man refused to turn off the truck had nothing to do with fear of arrest, and everything to do with what was hidden just inches away from him inside the cab.
Truck that would not stop.
By the time deputies realized the stop sticks weren't working the way they expected, the situation had already crossed into dangerous territory. The semi-truck, massive, heavy, and nearly unstoppable, continued rolling through the Costco depot lot despite multiple tires being punctured. Rubber shredded against asphalt, leaving long black scars across the pavement. Sparks flew intermittently beneath the undercarriage as metal rims began scraping the ground. Still, the driver refused to shut the engine off. From the outside, it looked chaotic. From the inside of the cab, officers would later understand it was something far worse. Deputies repositioned their vehicles to block exits, forming a loose perimeter. The priority was no longer just the driver, it was everyone else nearby. Even at 1:30 in the morning, the depot wasn't completely empty. Security personnel, early delivery drivers, and night staff were all within range of a vehicle that could kill without warning. "Just talk to me," one deputy pleaded through the open window. "You're not in trouble. We just want you to stop." The driver's response was erratic and fragmented. "They're going to put a bomb in here," he shouted. "It's going to burn." His words didn't align with reality, but they revealed something critical. The man wasn't simply refusing to comply. He was terrified. Not of law enforcement, but of something he believed would happen if he stopped moving. Inside the cab, the horn blared nonstop, a shrill mechanical scream echoing through the lot. Deputies shouted commands over the noise, their voices strained. "Cut the truck off. Put it in park. Stop moving." None of it registered. At one point, the driver steered directly toward a concrete median. Deputies scattered as the front end slammed into it, tearing apart the bumper and grille. Still, the engine roared. "Watch out. He's going to hit someone." The realization set in quickly. Talking was no longer working. Officers conferred briefly over the radio. OC spray was considered. Breaking the windshield was discussed. Tasers were an option, but deploying one on a moving semi-truck was a gamble that could end with the vehicle surging forward uncontrolled. Meanwhile, the corporal continued trying to reach the man emotionally. He changed tactics. "Where are you from?" he asked gently. The driver looked toward him, eyes glassy. "I know you're from heaven," the corporal said, attempting to anchor him in something familiar. "We're all God's children." For a moment, just a moment, it seemed to work. The driver's posture softened slightly. His grip on the wheel loosened. "I will feed you," the corporal said. "We'll get you cleaned up. Clothes. Whatever you need." But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The truck lurched again. Deputies now noticed something else, blood. At first, it was subtle. A dark smear on the driver's shirt. Then more visible stains along the center console area when headlights flashed through the broken window. No one could see exactly what it was yet, but it was enough to raise alarms. Speculation grew louder. "He's on something. Meth or PCP. Something heavy." Still, the driver continued repeating the same fears. Bombs. Burning. Smoke. The refusal to stop made no sense, unless stopping meant exposure. Finally, after repeated impacts and complete tire failure, the truck slowed as it approached the exit gate of the complex. Metal scraped loudly as the cab dragged itself forward. "This is it," one deputy muttered. Once inside the gate, the truck jerked to a halt. Silence followed, brief, eerie, and heavy. Then the shouting resumed. "Get out of the truck. Now. Do it now." The driver didn't comply. To prevent another escape attempt, EMS handed deputies a Higgin bar. Officers moved in quickly, striking the side window. Glass shattered outward as commands intensified. "Taser! Taser!" The door flew open. Deputies rushed forward, pulling the driver from the seat. He resisted weakly, shouting incoherently as he was dragged away from the cab. And then, one deputy froze. "There's a body in here." The words hit like a shockwave. "There's a dead body in here." Instantly, the tone shifted. Radios erupted. EMS was called forward urgently. Officers shouted for space, for calm, for control. Inside the cab, partially wedged between the driver and passenger seats, lay a woman, face down, motionless. "Ma'am, are you okay?" No response. They tried again. Louder. Closer. Nothing. When they attempted to move her, they realized she was stuck, her body rigid. "She's mortis," one officer said quietly. "She's dead." The truth was now unavoidable. This wasn't a medical episode. This wasn't just a drug-induced breakdown. This was a homicide scene, rolling through a Costco parking lot in the middle of the night. And the man who had refused to stop the truck? He had been sitting next to a corpse the entire time.
The woman in the cab.
The moment deputies confirmed there was a body inside the truck, the scene transformed instantly. What had been a chaotic pursuit was now a potential homicide investigation. Officers moved with urgency but precision, pulling the driver, still shouting incoherently, away from the cab and forcing him to the ground several feet away. Commands were sharp and repeated, no longer negotiable. "Sit down. Do not move. Sit down now." The man complied weakly, collapsing onto the curb, his body trembling. He was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear, despite the cool early morning air. Dark stains were visible on his shirt. Whether they were blood, oil, or something else entirely was unclear in the moment, but no one missed them. Inside the truck, deputies focused on the woman. She was positioned face down between the driver and passenger seats, her body wedged unnaturally in the narrow space. One arm was twisted beneath her torso. Her hair obscured most of her face. There was no movement, no sound. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Silence. They tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. As they attempted to lift her, resistance wasn't coming from her body, but from rigidity. Her limbs were stiff, her muscles locked. Rigor mortis. "She's been dead for a while," one deputy said quietly. EMS stepped in, but there was little they could do. She was pronounced dead at the scene. While medics focused on the body, other deputies turned their attention back to the driver. He appeared disoriented, confused, and in pain. As officers secured him, he pleaded repeatedly, "Please help me. That hurts." They explained the cuffs would hurt, but that he needed to remain still. His name, they soon learned, was Matthew Watley, a 46-year-old truck driver from New Jersey. The woman inside the truck was identified as Candace Thompson, also 46 years old. She was Matthew's girlfriend. As EMS examined Matthew, officers noticed more disturbing details. Blood was visible not only on his shirt, but also smeared across parts of the truck's interior. The dashboard, the center console, small streaks that suggested movement, struggle. Inside the cab, the scene was secured. Crime scene tape stretched across the entrance gate. Flashing lights illuminated the parking lot in alternating red and blue pulses. What had started as a call for help had become something far darker. Matthew was transported to Frederick Health Hospital for medical evaluation and mental health treatment. At the time, officers still didn't know exactly what had happened inside the truck. But they knew one thing for certain. Candace Thompson had not died naturally. The following day, detectives arrived at the hospital to speak with Matthew. Before they could even begin asking questions, before they had fully advised him of his rights, Matthew began talking. What he said made little sense. "I was out of my mind," he told them. "I felt like an alien." He described feeling detached from reality. Lost. Confused. As though he wasn't himself anymore. Detectives listened carefully, allowing him to speak freely. He claimed he had never felt anything like it before. When asked about Candace, Matthew explained that she had been traveling with him all week in the truck, eating together, sleeping in the cab, living on the road as many long-haul drivers do. "Every single day," he said, "she was with me." Detectives narrowed in on one critical question. "When is the last time you saw Candace alive?" Matthew hesitated. "With me the whole week." "But when was the last day you remember her alive and well?" they pressed. Matthew struggled to answer. He knew he'd been arrested on Sunday. He knew police had removed him from the truck that night. But when detectives told him Candace was already dead at that point, already deceased while he was driving through the Costco depot, Matthew had no explanation. He said he heard someone say she was drinking water. That statement didn't match reality. According to police reports, Candace had been dead long before officers opened the cab. Matthew fell silent. Detectives stopped the interview. At that moment, they had more questions than answers, and Matthew's mental state raised serious concerns about his capacity to continue speaking. But the investigation didn't stop. Witness statements began to paint a clearer and more disturbing picture of what happened that night. The original 911 caller was interviewed in detail. He explained that before calling authorities, he had climbed onto the running boards of Matthew's truck to check on him. Using a flashlight, he peered through the shattered window. What he saw haunted him. There was blood on the dashboard right in the center area. Matthew was positioned between the seats, hunched over. The caller heard sounds that made him believe Matthew was cutting or stabbing himself. At the time, the caller thought Matthew might be in a violent struggle with someone inside the truck, or harming himself. He had no idea there was a woman lying motionless just out of sight. As detectives processed the truck, they uncovered physical evidence that shifted the case from suspicion to certainty. A claw hammer was found near the driver's side door. Inside the cab, 2 folding knives were recovered. Candace's injuries were extensive. Blood on her face. Her shirt pulled up, exposing 2 large gashes close together on her back. Additional wounds were found on her hand and face once her body was removed. The preliminary cause of death, according to the Frederick County State's Attorney's Office, was blunt and sharp force trauma. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't self-defense. This was violence. And there was more. Police reports revealed a history of domestic violence between Matthew and Candace, documented by the Winslow Township Police Department in New Jersey. Prior incidents, prior calls, prior warnings, a pattern. On October 11, 2023, detectives attempted to speak with Matthew again. He appeared calmer, groomed, almost detached from the chaos that had unfolded weeks earlier. They asked him once more to explain what happened to Candace. This time, Matthew refused. He asked for his public defender. The interview ended, but the evidence did not. Court documents later revealed that Matthew Whatley was charged with both first and second-degree murder. He ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. His sentence, 40 years in prison. A lifetime on the road ended in a parking lot. A call for help uncovered a body. And a man who refused to stop his truck had been carrying a secret no one was prepared to find. With Matthew Whatley now in custody and Candace Thompson confirmed dead, investigators turned their focus to the most difficult task in the case, reconstructing what actually happened inside the cab of that truck. Unlike crimes that occur in a fixed location, this one had unfolded on the move. Over highways, through rest stops, across state lines. The truck itself was both the crime scene and the means of concealment, carrying evidence hundreds of miles before it was finally forced to stop. Detectives began by retracing Matthew and Candace's route during the week leading up to September 24th. According to records and Matthew's own statements, Candace had been traveling with him continuously. They slept in the truck, ate meals together at stops along the way. To outsiders, they appeared like many long-haul couples, living a hard but shared life on the road. But beneath that routine was a volatile history. Police reports from Winslow Township, New Jersey documented prior domestic violence incidents involving the couple, arguments that escalated, calls for help, a pattern of control and aggression that never fully resolved. Those records now took on chilling relevance. Investigators examined toll data, fuel receipts, and GPS logs from the truck. Each timestamp helped narrow the window of Candace's death, but also raised new questions. At some point during that week, Candace was attacked. The injuries told a brutal story. Blunt force trauma suggested repeated impacts, possibly from the claw hammer found near the driver's side door. Sharp force wounds indicated knives were also used. Two different types of violence. Two different weapons. This wasn't a single moment of rage. It was sustained. And yet, Matthew continued driving. Medical examiners estimated Candace had been dead for several hours before the truck arrived at the Costco depot, possibly longer. That meant Matthew had been sharing the confined space of the cab with her body for an extended period of time.
Why?
Investigators considered multiple possibilities.
Panic, shock, dissociation,
or deliberate avoidance. Matthew's behavior during the police encounter now looked different through that lens. His refusal to turn off the engine. His fear that stopping would lead to something terrible. His insistence that they would put a bomb in the truck. In his mind, stopping meant discovery. And discovery meant everything falling apart. Detectives reviewed bodycam footage frame by frame. At several points, bloodstains were faintly visible inside the cab, but only when headlights hit at the right angle. It was easy to see how officers initially missed it during the chaos. Witness statements further filled in the gaps. The 911 caller's description of Matthew hunched between the seats, making cutting motions, now aligned with the location of Candace's wounds. The broken glass. The blood on the dashboard. Nothing pointed to self-harm. Everything pointed inward, toward Candace. As prosecutors prepared a case, they focused on one unavoidable truth. Matthew had multiple opportunities to seek help before Candace died. He passed hospitals, truck stops, rest areas, police stations. Instead, he kept driving. The mental health aspect complicated the case, but did not erase responsibility. While Matthew appeared detached from reality during the encounter, there was no evidence he was legally insane at the time of the killing. In court filings, prosecutors emphasized intent, not premeditation, but conscious actions after the fact. The concealment, the continued operation of the truck, the refusal to comply when police arrived. Each decision mattered. Candace's family was notified and devastated. To them, the unanswered questions were unbearable. How long had she suffered? Why hadn't anyone known? Why had no one stopped him sooner? Those questions would never have complete answers. On October 11th, when detectives attempted to interview Matthew again, his refusal to speak without counsel marked a shift. The confusion was gone. The rambling statements had stopped. He understood the gravity now. The legal process moved forward quietly after that. No spectacle. No trial broadcast live. Just filings. Evidence. Negotiations. Matthew Whatley ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, first-degree charges were dropped. The sentence, 40 years, reflected both the brutality of the crime and the acknowledgement of mental instability without absolution. For Candace Thompson, justice came without a public reckoning, but with finality. A life lost in silence. A crime hidden on the road. And a truth uncovered only because one stranger noticed something wasn't right.
What the evidence couldn't ignore.
By the time prosecutors began assembling the case against Matthew Whatley, the investigation had moved beyond speculation and into something far more concrete. The evidence spoke clearly, even when Matthew no longer would. Forensic teams conducted a meticulous examination of the truck, treating it as both a crime scene and a timeline frozen in motion. Every surface was photographed. Every stain was documented. Every object was cataloged and logged. Inside the cab, blood spatter patterns told a story that words could not. Analysts determined that the distribution of blood was inconsistent with accidental injury or self-harm. Instead, it indicated repeated blows delivered at close range within the confined space of the truck. The dashboard blood stains aligned with the center console area, suggesting Candace had been upright at some point during the assault. Blood on the floorboard and seats indicated movement, either hers, his, or both, during the violence. The claw hammer found near the driver's side door became a key piece of evidence. Its weight, shape, and surface matched the blunt force injuries observed during Candace's autopsy. While the hammer alone did not account for all wounds, it explained the severity and pattern of trauma to her back and torso. The knives found inside the cab added another layer. 2 folding knives. Easily accessible. Common tools for truck drivers, but devastating when used as weapons. Medical examiners concluded Candace sustained sharp force injuries consistent with knife wounds. The proximity of the wounds suggested repeated strikes rather than a single impulsive act. Together, the hammer and knives painted a picture of escalation. This wasn't one moment of loss of control. It was a sequence. Investigators also focused heavily on timing. Determining when Candace died was crucial, not just to establish guilt, but to understand Matthew's actions afterward. Based on rigor mortis, body temperature, and lividity, medical examiners estimated Candace had been dead for several hours before law enforcement discovered her body, possibly longer. That meant Matthew had continued driving, possibly across state lines, while her body remained in the cab. He passed way stations, delivery depots, rest stops. He interacted with people. And yet, no one noticed until the moment he unraveled in the Costco lot. Prosecutors argued that Matthew's behavior during the police encounter was not random. His refusal to turn off the truck, his paranoia about bombs and smoke, his panic at the idea of stopping, all aligned with one central fear: exposure. Stopping the truck meant someone would look inside. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. The 9/11 caller's testimony became critical. His account placed Matthew between the seats, hunched forward, with blood already visible before deputies arrived. That detail alone disproved any claim that Candace's death occurred after police intervention. It also reinforced the timeline. Candace was already dead, or very close to it, while Matthew was still driving. The caller's assumption that Matthew might be harming himself was understandable in the moment. But in hindsight, it was tragically clear that the violence had already been inflicted on someone else. Matthew's own statements further complicated his defense. Though disorganized, he never claimed an accident. He never suggested Candace attacked him. He never said she was alive when officers arrived. Instead, his statements were vague, detached, and non-committal, often deflecting responsibility without offering an alternative explanation. From a legal standpoint, silence after requesting counsel did not help or hurt him. But the evidence already filled the gaps. Prosecutors reviewed Matthew's prior domestic violence history with Candace in detail. Though those incidents occurred in another jurisdiction, they were admissible for context and pattern. They demonstrated a relationship marked by volatility, control, and previous violence. This wasn't a sudden anomaly. It was an escalation. Candace's family provided victim impact statements during pretrial proceedings. They described a woman who loved deeply, trusted easily, and believed things would get better. They also described fear. Fear they hadn't fully understood until it was too late. The prosecution made a strategic decision: pursue a plea rather than risk the uncertainties of trial, particularly given Matthew's mental health concerns. While first-degree murder charges remained on the table, second-degree murder offered certainty, accountability, finality, a guaranteed sentence. Matthew Watley accepted the plea. In court, there was no dramatic confession, no emotional outburst, just acknowledgement of responsibility under the law. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison, no parole for decades. As the gavel fell, the case formally closed, but the questions lingered. How long had Candace suffered? What was Matthew thinking as he continued to drive? Could anything have stopped this sooner? Those questions don't come with clean answers. But one truth remained undeniable. Candace Thompson didn't disappear. She was hidden until the truth forced itself into the open. As the legal case against Matthew Watley moved toward resolution, another question lingered beneath the surface, one that law enforcement, mental health professionals, and the public all struggled to reconcile. What was happening inside Matthew's mind that night? The bodycam footage, witness statements, and hospital records painted a picture not just of violence, but of psychological collapse unfolding in real time. From the moment deputies first made contact with Matthew in the Costco parking lot, his behavior followed a pattern consistent with extreme mental distress. His speech was fragmented. His thoughts jumped erratically. He fixated on imagined threats, bombs, smoke, fire, none of which existed. To responding deputies, it looked like substance-induced psychosis. But toxicology reports later complicated that assumption. While Matthew showed signs consistent with stimulant-induced paranoia, there was no definitive evidence that drugs alone could explain the depth of his delusions. Instead, mental health professionals reviewing the case suggested a convergence of factors: emotional instability, stress, exhaustion, possible substance use, and unresolved violent tendencies. Long-haul trucking is an isolating profession. Drivers spend days, sometimes weeks, alone in confined spaces, sleeping irregularly, eating poorly, and operating under constant pressure to meet delivery deadlines. For someone already struggling with anger or control issues, that isolation can act as a pressure cooker. Candace had been traveling with Matthew continuously, in a space no larger than a walk-in closet. Investigators believe tensions likely escalated gradually, fueled by fatigue and unresolved conflict. There was no single trigger identified, but the violence appeared sudden only because no one else was there to witness the buildup. The confined environment of the cab mattered. There was nowhere to retreat, no separate rooms, no escape. Once violence began, it would have been nearly impossible for Candace to flee. Matthew's later statements, feeling like an alien, disconnected from reality, were consistent with dissociation, a psychological state where a person detaches from their actions or surroundings. Dissociation does not excuse violence, but it can explain how someone continues functioning after committing it. Driving, talking, avoiding discovery. In Matthew's mind, movement became safety. Stopping meant confrontation, not just with police, but with reality itself. This explains his fixation during the standoff. The engine could not stop. The truck could not be turned off. As long as it was moving, the truth stayed hidden. Mental health professionals reviewing the footage noted another key detail. Matthew responded briefly to empathy. When the corporal spoke calmly, when he offered prayer, when he spoke about food and clothing. For fleeting moments, Matthew seemed present. But those moments were fragile, quickly overwhelmed by paranoia and fear. This fluctuation is common in acute psychological crises. A person may appear reachable one second, completely unreachable the next. Deputies on scene were forced to make decisions in seconds, without knowing what was inside the truck, without knowing a homicide had already occurred, and without knowing how close the situation was to becoming deadly for bystanders. From a law enforcement perspective, the response was measured. They prioritized containment. They attempted de-escalation repeatedly. They avoided lethal force. Only when all other options failed did they physically intervene. Once the body was discovered, everything clicked into place. The paranoia, the refusal to stop, the desperation. Matthew wasn't running from police. He was running from what he had done. In court filings, mental health evaluations acknowledged Matthew's psychological instability, but concluded it did not rise to the level of legal insanity. He understood right from wrong. He knew Candace was dead. He knew discovery was inevitable. He just couldn't face it. This distinction mattered. Mental illness can explain behavior. It cannot erase accountability. For Candace, psychological explanations offer little comfort. Her death was not an abstract case study, it was a real, violent end to a real life. But understanding Matthew's mental collapse does serve a purpose. It highlights warning signs, patterns, missed opportunities for intervention. Domestic violence rarely begins with homicide. It escalates. It repeats. It normalizes. And when isolation removes witnesses, the danger multiplies. Matthew's breakdown didn't begin in the Costco parking lot. It ended there.
The moments that prevented something worse.
By the time the truck finally stopped inside the gate of the Costco depot, the outcome was already sealed for Candace Thompson. But what followed still mattered, because the decisions made in those final moments prevented the situation from becoming even more catastrophic. From a law enforcement perspective, this incident sits at the intersection of crisis response, public safety, and restraint under pressure. The deputies who responded that night were dealing with an unpredictable driver operating a multi-ton vehicle in a populated commercial area. Any misstep could have resulted in civilian deaths. And yet, none occurred. That wasn't luck.
It was decision-making.
When deputies first realized the driver was refusing to exit the truck, they didn't rush in. They slowed the encounter down. They created distance. They tried to communicate. Repeatedly. They recognized early that this wasn't a typical defiance scenario. Matthew wasn't arguing. He wasn't threatening officers directly. He was trapped inside his own fear. The placement of stop sticks wasn't meant to provoke. It was meant to limit mobility without forcing immediate confrontation. Even when the tires began to fail, deputies adjusted, repositioned, and continued trying to de-escalate. At several points, they could have escalated to lethal force. A semi-truck can be a weapon. Yet they didn't. They waited. They warned each other. They warned civilians. They kept distance. The corporal's attempts at verbal de-escalation were textbook. He avoided accusations. He avoided threats. He framed compliance as help, not punishment. We're not here to lock you up. We just want to make sure you're okay. Even when frustration grew, they returned to calm instruction. When that failed, deputies transitioned carefully, breaking the window only when the truck was fully immobilized. Taser deployment was controlled, targeted, and limited. Once Matthew was removed, officers immediately recognized the medical emergency unfolding inside the cab. They didn't hesitate. They didn't argue. They acted. EMS was called forward instantly. The discovery of Candace's body could have triggered panic, anger, or retribution. Instead, deputies compartmentalized. They secured Matthew. They preserved the scene. They treated the truck as evidence. That discipline mattered. Because everything that followed, the prosecution, the conviction, the sentence, depended on what they did in those minutes. This case is often discussed online for its shocking discovery. But it's equally important to recognize what didn't happen. No officer fired a weapon. No civilian was struck. No bystander was harmed. In a scenario that could have ended with multiple deaths, it ended with one tragedy, not many. That distinction doesn't minimize Candace's death. It honors restraint. From a broader perspective, the case highlights how unpredictable domestic violence can become when isolated from public view. No one outside the truck knew what was happening inside, until the driver unraveled in public. It also underscores how mental health crises intersect with criminal behavior. Deputies were forced to navigate both simultaneously, without knowing the full context. They had seconds. They had limited information. They had a massive vehicle in motion. And they made it stop. Candace's story would have remained hidden if not for one stranger's instinct to call for help, and a group of deputies who took that call seriously. The system didn't save her, but it prevented more loss. And sometimes, that's the difference between tragedy and catastrophe.
The warning signs no one saw.
Once the scene was secured and Matthew Watley was transported to the hospital, the focus shifted from chaos to questions. Not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen at all. Because when investigators stepped back and examined the timeline, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One that didn't start at the Costco depot. One that didn't even begin that night. It had been building quietly for years. According to police records, Matthew and Candace Thompson shared a long, volatile history. Their relationship was not unknown to law enforcement. Reports from the Winslow Township Police Department in New Jersey documented repeated domestic disturbances involving the couple.
Arguments.
Physical confrontations. Calls for help that ended without permanent separation. Each incident, on its own, seemed survivable. Together, they told a story no one fully stopped. Candace had been traveling with Matthew for days before her death, riding along in the confined space of a semi-truck cab. For most people, that would be uncomfortable. For someone in a turbulent relationship, it could be terrifying. There was no clear break, no documented escape attempt, no intervention before it was too late. And that's one of the most haunting realities of this case. Candace vanished from public view long before she died. When detectives reviewed the 9/11 caller's statement, one detail stood out. Before calling for help, the caller climbed onto the running boards and looked inside the truck. What he saw didn't make sense at the time. Blood on the dash. The driver positioned between the seats. Sounds that suggested violence, but not towards someone else, at least not obviously. The caller assumed Matthew was hurting himself. That assumption may have delayed the realization that someone else was already dead. This is how domestic violence often hides in plain sight. It doesn't always look like screaming or visible injuries. Sometimes it looks like confusion. Sometimes it looks like mental illness. Sometimes it looks like a man unraveling alone. But Candace wasn't alone. She was trapped. When her body was examined, investigators documented blunt force trauma and sharp force wounds. 2 large gashes close together on her back. Additional injuries to her hand and face. These weren't accidental. They weren't self-inflicted. They were deliberate. The presence of a claw hammer near the driver's door and folding knives inside the cab painted a grim picture. Tools within reach. Escalation within inches. Yet Matthew never explained what happened. Even after agreeing to speak with detectives, his account dissolved into fragments. Aliens, spaceships, confusion, fear. Whether these statements were genuine psychosis, drug-induced delusion, or strategic avoidance remains a question only he truly knows. But the damage was real and irreversible. When detectives attempted a second interview weeks later, Matthew refused to speak without his public defender. By then, the case no longer relied on his words. The evidence spoke loudly enough. This chapter of the story forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. The system often reacts after violence, not before it. Repeated domestic incidents don't always result in permanent protection. Mental health crises aren't always treated as imminent danger. And when 2 people disappear into isolation together, there may be no witnesses until the end. Candace's death wasn't sudden. It was the final point on a long, ignored trajectory. Her story raises questions that don't have easy answers. How many warnings are enough? When does instability become emergency? And how many victims live and die between the lines of police reports? This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a slow collapse. And by the time it became public, the only thing left was accountability.
The sentence, the silence, and what remains.
By the time Matthew Watley stood before the court, the chaos of that September night had long since faded. No sirens, no shouting, no flashing lights. Only paperwork, procedure, and the weight of finality. The Frederick County State's Attorney's Office formally charged Matthew Watley with both first-degree and second-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical injuries, the weapons found inside the truck, the documented history of domestic violence, the body discovered mere feet from where he sat. There was no alternate narrative that could withstand scrutiny. And eventually there was no trial. Matthew Watley pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. With that plea came the end of unanswered questions and the beginning of permanent consequences. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed to dismiss the first-degree murder charge, avoiding a lengthy trial and sparing Candace's family from reliving the details in open court. The sentence was decisive. 40 years behind bars. 4 decades in a prison cell. 4 decades without freedom. 4 decades measured against a life that was taken. For Candace Thompson, justice came too late to matter to her, but it mattered to those she left behind. In cases like this, sentencing is often portrayed as closure. But closure is a myth. There is no sentence that restores a life. No verdict that erases fear. No courtroom that heals years of trauma. What remains instead is accountability and memory. Candace's story now exists in police records, court documents, and footage that captured the final hours of her life without anyone knowing it at the time. Her name may never trend. Her face may never be widely recognized. But her story matters. It matters because it exposes how domestic violence can escalate unnoticed. It matters because it shows how mental health crises and violent behavior can intersect catastrophically. And it matters because it reminds us that some victims disappear long before they die. Matthew Watley will spend the majority of his remaining life in prison. He will wake up every morning confined by concrete walls, razor wire, and the knowledge that the road ends there. No truck, no highway, no escape,
Just time.
and silence. For law enforcement, this case became another entry in the system, resolved, closed, archived. For the deputies involved, it remains unforgettable. The moment they opened that truck door is something none of them will ever unsee. For the 911 caller, it's the memory of trying to help a stranger and discovering something far darker than expected. And for Candace, it is the tragedy of a life reduced to evidence photos and autopsy reports. Her final moments were unseen, her fear unheard, her fate sealed in a place no one thought to look. This is why these stories matter. Not for shock, not for spectacle, but for awareness. Because the signs are often there. Because the danger is often ignored. And because somewhere, right now, another victim may be riding quietly beside the person who will eventually destroy them. If telling this story forces even one person to recognize the warning signs sooner, or encourages someone to leave before it's too late, then Candace's death will not be forgotten in vain. This case is closed, but the lesson remains.
Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you're someone who values real stories and real details. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future documentaries like this. New videos are coming and your support helps keep this content going.